Support for Trifles comes from the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you, who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the colorman was retired, the three-quarter was missing, and the client was illustrious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever wondered why Sherlock Holmes had 3 different colored dressing gowns? Or what a Crockford is?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 284, Witchcraft. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, I must ask you, are you in fact, or do you in fact, have no defense for it?
No, I do not have a fence for it. And that's largely because of the way the property is laid out. You know, I had these white pickets and then some chain link for a while, but they all fell over. And the deer, you know, would just sort of nuzzle up to the fences and then chuckle at me as the sun went down. So I said, the hell with it.
Well, clearly with the sun up, the heat was too intense for it.
No, I'm not talking about tents. I'm talking about fences.
Oh. And once again, I must ask myself, what good would common sense for us do? Yes, we are going to be talking about witchcraft here in this episode of Trifles. And before we do, we just want to remind you that the show notes are available at ihose.co/trifles284, all lowercase. That'll take you directly to the Sherlock Holmes podcast.com website. You can poke around there. We have now 6 seasons of archives that you can find. And of course, you can find us on whatever podcasting listening device or platform you prefer. I think we're on just about all of them, certainly on the big ones like Spotify, Apple, Google Play, etc. But please, wherever you find us, subscribe to us. Make sure you get those updates. And if you'd like to be notified by email when we are available, you can do that right on our site. And we would be remiss if we didn't remind you that all of our Patreon supporters, and you can support us for as little as $1 a month, are all eligible for 2 drawings. One, a monthly drawing for back issues of the Baker Street Journal, and another quarterly drawing for a free annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal. So get on board there, become a patron, and take part in that eligibility today. Well, the past couple of episodes have brought us in touch with the supernatural. If you recall, in episode 282, Holmes demonstrated his powers with Sherlock Holmes's tours de force. We talked about 10 different instances of him demonstrating those powers. And then in episode 283, just the last episode, Hocus Pocus, we talked about how he was assumed to have powers of a sorcerer or a wizard because of the surprise elements of his deductions. And we're going to continue this nod toward the supernatural, and in this case we're looking at witchcraft. Bert, you were able to unearth something, a previous piece of scholarship, and just a reminder, this is one of those Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist episodes where we look at a past piece of scholarship. Why don't you bring us up to speed on exactly what witchcraft we might find?
I would love to tell you what's going on here. What's going on here is a book that was published in the 1970s, Beyond Baker Street, a Sherlockian anthology, edited by Michael Harrison. And among the papers in that book, it's a very handsome book, by the way, and I believe it's well available on abebooks.com if anyone has the interest. But among the papers is a paper by Frank Dunbar. Now Frank Allen. And that is Frank Alfred Dunbar Allen. And at the time of writing, he was the chairman of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London and a prominent pharmacist in Britain and a very interesting guy. His godfather was Sir Herbert Beerbohm Tree. He was born into a family of people who were connected with the theater. And he wrote this paper, which appears in Beyond Baker Street, called Witchcraft in Baker Street. Now, it begins with reviewing the case, which is a good idea for our listeners who might not recall all the details of the Milverton affair. And the lovely thing about this paper is that it shows you what happens when you just decide, when you take an approach to look at a case of Sherlock Holmes from a very different angle. And it's a wonderful antidote if you are one of those people who thinks, everything has been written. I've just got no ideas. There's nothing I can do to write a paper. But take a look at what Frank Allen does here. So he begins with a recap of the Milverton case. Charles Augustus Milverton, a late Victorian blackmailer living in apparent style at Appledore Towers beside Hampstead Heath, London, calls at 221B Baker Street to negotiate with Sherlock Holmes, who is acting on behalf of the young and beautiful Lady Eva Brackwell. Well, now, Allen goes on to look at the other details of the case, but one of the conclusions he comes to early on in his review of the events is, we're calling Milverton the worst man in London. Is that really true? I mean, there are things, says Allen, about this case that don't really ring true. This whole narrative, he says, opens and proceeds as if some spell of evil had been cast upon every character. And that, he says, is what I think happened. And the first to deviate from his normal behavior and to demonstrate this wrong influence is Sherlock Holmes himself. He says, look what's going on here. We've been told Sherlock Holmes has a cold scientific brain, and we know him to be expert in so many different areas. Yes, yet on the first page of this case, we find him expressing himself with a quite unscientific revulsion against a branch of natural creation. He talks about a creeping, shrinking sensation whenever he confronts the serpents at the zoo. And finally, he falls into a classic pathetic fallacy when he finds their faces wicked.
And this is, coming from an expert herpetologist, as Allen reminds us. Holmes was able to identify an Indian swamp adder in the dark, no less, in the speckled band. So, Milverton really must have been quite something if he revulsed Holmes off of his, natural expertise in herpetology.
Yes, and says Allen, with Holmes's normal scientific detachment dislocated, we must for once be wary here of accepting Holmes's judgments uncritically. And if some force of evil has caused distortion, then let us reveal its source if we can. And then Allen goes into some of the actions that Holmes undertook along with Watson. He says, Holmes attempted robbery with violence and with Watson brandishing a chair. Such joint failure of proper observances was not at all like Holmes and Watson's normal behavior. This is another reason why he says we smell something amiss in the Milverton case. And then he says, just think about the large revolver that Milverton takes from his pocket when he's in Baker Street. Well, that's not the sort of firearm you'd expect a a well-to-do, fashionable blackmailer to carry. There should be a pearl-handled automatic or a derringer or something like that. This suggests to me, he says, that Milverton probably had to go to some army surplus store to get the tools of his trade. And even some of his wardrobe might have been picked up from that same source. A semi-military smoking jacket, claret-colored with a black velvet collar. Poor Milverton's wardrobe. And then he has a shaggy astrakhan coat. My, if there's one fur that's never shaggy except when it's decrepit, it's astrakhan. Oh, a small, stout man in a shaggy astrakhan. And then, you can see the way this poor chap, he says about Milverton, is cherishing his decrepit fur coat by folding it with great deliberation over the back of a chair. Or maybe he's trying to place it so that its lining is outward, so he can hide its disgraceful shagginess.
And, clearly what we have here with Milverton is someone in the blackmailing community who is trying to keep up with the Joneses. He's doing his best to put off an air of success. As you say, they're hiding his astrakhan's shagginess, but also by upkeeping his staff and the carriage he took over with the 2 chestnut horses and the footmen. I mean, these are all expenses that Milverton, who was probably impecunious at this point, was struggling with. And the worst man, well, maybe the worst treated man in London, maybe the worst compensated man in London, maybe the worst man with a budget in London. I mean, who knows?
That's true. Alan does a lovely job. He goes through so many other things here. He says he finds indications that Milverton had to take in lodgers. That's one of the reasons why his office
Airbnb, right?
That's right. His safe was not really very robust. He only had one marble bust in his library or in his office. He smoked cheap cigars. The trees, he says, we know the trees in Appledore Towers were described as small ones. So they may have been cutting down the timber to raise money.
Yeah, and there was no sign of a decanter in his study. Despite Holmes's view of Milverton as a little man who does himself well, there was no sign at all of an evening glass or nightcap.
Yeah. Well, his crowning misfortune, says Alan, was to fall foul of the beautiful Lady Eva Brackwell. And we'll find out more about that, likely after this word from our sponsor.
Yes, we're in the middle of one of those Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist episodes of Trifles, where we're looking at a classic piece of Sherlockian scholarship. Well, where can you find classic Sherlockian scholarship? Well, there are a couple of places, and we can think of one of them right off the bat that's available right now. It's The Grand Game, Volume 2, which contains Sherlockian scholarship from a variety of sources, mostly the Baker Street Journal, from 1960 to 2010. Volume 2 is all that's left because Volume 1 was so popular, it sold out. We'll have more news on bringing Volume 1 back from the dead in future episodes, but for now, get on over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and pick up your copy of Volume 2 of The Grand Game, covering the last half-century of Sherlockian scholarship. You won't find better work in a single volume anywhere else. Go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and get The Grand Game Volume 2 today.
All right, we are back and ready to jump into everything related to witchcraft in Baker Street as Lady Eva Brackwell rears her regal and attractive head.
Yes, the time has come to reveal, says Alan, Holmes's illustrious client, Lady Eva Brackwell, as the great evil genius of this case.
That's a shocker.
It's incredible. It is a shocker because he says, she was the most beautiful debutante of the previous season. But the hard-headed Holmes, he believes, permitted himself to be recruited as her hired help just to advance her own disreputable enterprise, which was, in essence, to be rid of some inconvenient mementos of an earlier unprofitable sweetheart and go on to make a career out of marrying a narrow-minded and evidently unforgiving earl. And in deviating the served Lady Eva Brackwell, Holmes came near to destroying himself and Watson, too.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the way Holmes invited, he initially refused Watson's help, but, Watson was obviously very handy with his ability to create silk masks, and Holmes invited him in, and, Watson almost took the whole operation down because he was the one who was nearly nabbed as he scrambled over the garden wall at Appledore Towers.
Yes. Well, then Frank Allen takes us through more actions by Holmes that are suspect. He says, look how Holmes trifled cynically with the affections of Agatha, the servant girl at Appledore Towers, even to their becoming engaged. This attitude, this idea that affairs of the heart of the lower orders are expendable and comic, quite shocked his friend Watson, as it does us. And this is all because of Lady Eva's evil influence. Through her, both Holmes and Watson become passive accessories to murder. And Holmes later coolly admits to Inspector Lestrade that his sympathies were identified with the criminal's private revenge. Ooh.
Well, I mean, this is exactly where we see ourselves being led by the situation that Frank Allen describes. I mean, it was where Holmes and Watson were being led by Lady Eva. And, her name itself should have tipped them off. Brackwell. This is not Blackwell, which is a little more regal. It's Brackwell, as in bracken. Where do we find bracken in the canon? It is actually specifically mentioned in The Hound of the Baskervilles, another tale that involved the supernatural, the evil, and this was when Sir Henry and Watson were making their way to Baskerville Hall, and Watson noted the dripping moss and fleshy hart's tongue ferns, and bronzing bracken and mottled bramble gleamed in the light of the sinking sun.
Ooh. Oh, I like that very much. Yes, well, you've pointed us in exactly the right direction. Allen says, Brackwell indicates in cipher Lady Eva's tainted blood because she was a witch, descended from a line of hereditary guardians of an ancient, pagan, sacred spring, a saline one, hence Brack. And such occupations stand and include the primeval origin of witches, and she was one, the source of the evil that directs, permeates, and consumes the principles of this most bizarre case. And then his final note, Allen says, the mystery of the witches and the witchcraft is evident here in another way, too, because after scaling the garden wall, Holmes and Watson are reported to have run 2 miles across Hampstead Heath. Well, the Heath, says Allen, is a little more than a mile across at its widest point, so it seems that our heroes were running in a thaumaturgic circle.
See, that's what witchcraft will do to you. When you arouse the need in me, proceed with what you're leading me to. And it all tends to be just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes. He's a man who loathes the human race.
What circumstances might bring him to that?
Well, boy brought up in lonely isolation, starved of affection, probably in one of London's outer suburbs.